let me say I thought that was great, because that started us off with what I thought was a tremendous take on one company's approach to this world of green manufacturing. I should say, I know Jim told you a bit about me, but my name's Peter Marsh, and I used to work at the Financial Times for many years, where amongst many people I spoke to, I did have a long conversation with Ray Anderson a few years ago, the former chairman, who died a few years ago, sadly, who certainly educated me an awful lot about what Interface is doing in this green manufacturing world. Just to try to explain the format, I'm going to be just introducing the rest of the panel. Each of them will just have 2 minutes to say something about their take on this agenda that we've got this evening. And then we're going to have a conversation really between ourselves for the next 20-25 minutes. Before then, we open it all up to everybody else to ask questions, make comments, because I'm sure there's a tremendous number of things we can be talking about in this rather broad area of green manufacturing. What is the value of it? So you've all got to try to contain yourselves. You've only got 2 minutes. And so I'm just going to introduce each one in turn, starting on my right. This is Suzanne Baker, who's in charge of environmental affairs, really, for it used to be called the Engineering Employers Federation, but that's too kind of old-fashioned for them nowadays, so they call themselves the EEF. And I do know the organisation very well. They're a great organisation that represent just about all parts of manufacturing in the UK. So, Suzanne, your 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. My name's Susanna Baker, and as Peter explained, I work for EEF, the manufacturers organisation, and we represent around 6,000 companies, representing 900,000 employees across all different sectors in the engineering, manufacturing and technology-based industries. I've been at EEF for about 4 years, and since I've been here, there has been a huge change from what I can see in how manufacturing is perceived. It's really risen up the political agenda as the government attempts to rebalance the economy in the wake of the terrible economic turmoil that we found ourselves in. And at the same time, we've seen commodity prices displaying huge volatility, energy prices on an upward trajectory, and a growing body of evidence that shows and suggests that pressure on resources will continue into the future and indeed accelerate, and all this in the context of a changing climate. So it's been little wonder that the debate from where I have been sitting has been focused around risk management, around resource efficiency and productivity, and indeed resilience. And I think internalising the costs and managing price volatility and trying to manage the ever-increasing risks that manufacturers are facing is definitely the driving force for green within mainstream manufacturing, indeed, certainly within our membership. But arguably, you could say they are the trends that have shaped manufacturing for many years. I was reading a McKinsey piece today talking about lean manufacturing, and they were actually arguing that lean manufacturing was one of the biggest manufacturing ideas of the last 50 years. I would, when I go to visit manufacturing sites, I've always been struck by the focus on continual improvement, waste avoidance, on quality, and really understanding what the customer values most of all. But arguably, lean hasn't been fully realised yet. And the piece today was arguing that new developments in technology, in analytics, and indeed psychology can help drive the next tranche of understanding and efficiency and productivity within manufacturing processes. In some of the blurbs for today, there was a question: has manufacturing reached a crossroads? And I would say it has. We have executives now who really understand the case for change. We have a government who's focused on creating an environment for enabling green business models to flourish. And we have the technology and analytics and psychology developments that will see the next tranche of productivity flow through manufacturing. So that's my 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, a bit more than 2 minutes, but never mind. The next person, Jonathan Garrett, is the representative here from Jaguar Land Rover. He's the head of corporate social responsibility. And I'm sure many of you know this, but Jaguar Land Rover really has been perhaps the great success story in manufacturing in Britain in the last 5 years. Under the ownership, of course, of Tata of India, it's been investing a huge amount, probably, I think I counted it up once, about £7 billion, most of that going into Britain in either new model design or manufacturing investments, increased its employment hugely, plus its employment of engineers. So in your 2 minutes, Jonathan, if you can just give us your take on how you approach at Jaguar Land Rover this kind of green area to manufacturing.
Thank you, and Mike does send his apologies. It was interesting, I got a little phone call this morning from Mike saying, I don't think I'm going to be able to make it this afternoon. So he does send his apologies, but one thing to be really clear from Mike and also our CEO, Ralph Spate, is they're both really passionate about manufacturing in this country. Manufacturing really matters. A lot of people don't think we make anything in this country anymore, and it is in rude health. And interestingly, if I go back to 2008, I'm sitting here in our financial institution, we were literally in dire straits right there. And JLR was in a crisis mode itself. It nearly didn't survive in 2008. So it literally has transformed itself in that time. But to be successful in that sort of global economy, we have to compete against the likes of the companies in Germany that were exemplars in manufacturing and export-led. And China is catching up in that area too. So we're in big catch-up mode, and that sort of manufacturing, that renaissance in manufacturing starts before you even get into the factory. We have a big challenge in this country about getting enough young people into manufacturing. We're going to be 200,000 engineers short by the end of the decade. So we literally work with 22,000 school children every year to inspire them to get into careers in our industry. Because if we don't have that talent, we won't have an industry going forward. We're also investing a lot of money. We've formed a joint venture organisation with Warwick Manufacturing Group. So that's a collaborative manufacturing and academic institution at the University of Warwick. We've also invested £50 million in the National Automotive Innovation Centre, or NAIC. And that is a cross-sector, automotive sector vehicle for putting green technologies in this country. If we don't invest in the R&D, we're not going to have the manufacturing to build it. So investment in R&D is key. So what else would Mike talk about? He would also talk about the concept of the car industry not being high-tech. This is incredibly high-tech. You can't get more high-tech than a car. The amount of code that goes into a car now is incredible. Ian, tell me how many components in a car? 4,000? 4,000 components in a car. It's incredibly complex. So there's a lot of design and innovation and thousands of jobs that go into that. So this thing about technology and innovation go hand in hand in our sector. Now we've talked about, Nigel's talked about renewables and investment. Jaguar Land Rover's invested £500 million in a brand new engine factory in Wolverhampton. And that's, as we speak, having 21,000 solar panels put on its roof is going to be the biggest roof-mounted solar array in this country. So we are putting some serious money in there, but it's more than just green energy. It's got to be about, and we've heard it today, we really agree with Nigel's view about this supplying the supplier. This is about closing those loops. And for us, our big material is aluminium, which is used for lightweighting our cars. 80% of the life cycle of our product is in the use phase of the vehicle. So aluminium is our big drive. And we use closed loop aluminium recycling. So the offcuts from our press shop go straight back to our supplier to be processed into the next batch. But we're taking it to the next step, how can we use post-consumer waste in our vehicles. So aluminium drinks cans, looking at Joe in the audience there, we can take that material, we're doing an R&D project right now, how we can use the aluminium in drinks cans to get to a 75% recycled content in our vehicles. And it's millions of pounds worth of savings to be had.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Now the third person who you haven't yet heard from is Matt Bully, who's the Managing Director, and this is a kind of slightly odd title, Caterpillar Reman Europe. And I thought to begin with it's something to do with some kind of strange virility clinic, but in fact it's not. It's part of the esteemed Caterpillar. It's nothing to do with Viagra, is it?
No. Certainly not.
But anyway, I'm sure everyone knows Caterpillar is a huge maker of huge machines, and you're actually in charge of a big bit of the remanufacturing of it. So maybe explain that, please.
So I think for us, the remanufacturing piece and the distinction is very, very key, and partly the reason I take the opportunity to come and talk to events like this is to try and sort of spread the word a little bit. We've been remanufacturing for 40 years this year, and we've been quietly getting on with that. And a lot of the points that Nigel raised around actually it's good business, it's really been customer-led. When we talk about the extended life cycle, the overall owning and operating costs of a lot of our equipment, be that generators, mining equipment, construction equipment, that overall cost, they're not cheap pieces of equipment. People are using them to run their own businesses, and therefore we're constantly looking to eliminate waste and reduce waste, be that in the product design, so how are we burning less fuel to move more material. But the remanufacturing piece then comes in terms of a service option, and we use a closed loop where we've got a very close relationship. We bring about 95% of our material back into our facilities, and the Reman division is 14 locations across the globe, and we remanufacture from complete engines and transmissions down to the external pieces of the engine as well, so fuel injectors, starters, turbos and alternators. Everything gets stripped back down to every last nut and bolt. Certain amount of those processes at the moment, and this is where we come to big bold goals. How do we continue to not throw anything away? But at the moment, a certain portion of the engine or transmission will get put into the recycling loops. Other parts will always get reused. And then the innovation and the research and development piece is our metal deposition technologies. So how we spraying metal, rebuilding surfaces back, eliminating cracks in an engine block as it's been used over its life, and bringing it back together in a manufacturing, very well controlled environment to a product that performs as well, if not better, than when the engine or transmission first went into production. It's about 60 or 70% of the cost of a new engine, and it's backed up by a warranty as you would get with a new product. And so for our customers, that's very good value. It means we're not having to have supply chain volatility and buying materials and metals coming back in to build a new engine. And equally, it's allowing our machines, which also get full rebuilds, to go back in and continue to run for many lives. Certain products we run in Shrewsbury on a rail application. We've run through that cycle. They're warranted for 400,000 miles, and we've run them through the remanufacturing cycle 5 or 6 times. So certainly advantages for us in terms of a sustainable business, but it is good for our customers, and that's where it's led, but it also is very good for the environment as well.
Okay, right. Well, thank you to all of you for just setting the scene from your own perspectives. I think what I want to try and do in the next 45 minutes, including the questions, is to try and kind of move away from the real micro look at what the people here have been talking about. They've been necessarily talking about this agenda through the eyes of their own companies, through what they've been doing, through what they know about. And I think we've got to try and broaden things out a little bit to take into account what the whole of manufacturing is doing, or what it can do, how it can be measured, and to what degree doing things in Britain gives the UK some kind of economic advantage, which seems to me to be the big points. I mean, there's lots of ways of tackling those questions, but perhaps one thing, but we can start with Suzanne really. has the government got the balance right in terms of the legislation and the regulations? If you want more green manufacturing, the easy way to do it is pretty much close it all down through having huge energy costs, carbon levies, etc., which some bits of manufacturing feel that is happening to them. In other words, the legislation trying to lift green manufacturing is making it so difficult for people to use energy that it's putting costs up. I mean, it'd be interesting to get your general take on this, particularly from the point of view of very high energy users, which you do represent, and then we'll perhaps ask the other people from the point of view of their own manufacturers.
Yeah, well, EEF has been, I think, leading the debate about energy costs. And we very much feel that the balance isn't quite right at the moment, that energy costs are too high, and particularly what smarts is the unilateral nature of some of the instruments that are in place, because that means that there is a cost borne by manufacturers here in the UK which aren't being felt by manufacturers elsewhere in the world, or indeed Europe. The carbon price floor is one particular instrument which we have concerns about, and we think there are ways in which you could achieve the same results but in a much more cost-effective way. And partly some of the concern around that is around the impacts on energy-intensive industries. These are, in many cases, industries that have to a huge technological and innovation challenge in order to meet the demands of carbon budgets out to 2050. And like the energy sector, they only have maybe 1 or 2 investment cycles before now and 2050. So what our focus should be on is actually how are we going to move that sector or those sectors to that position in a way which fits with their investment intentions. And this understanding about investment cycles is something which doesn't really fit particularly well when you're having to meet quite short-term climate targets, because the demonstration and testing of the technology is a much longer process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what's your take on this, Nigel? You've got manufacturing operations in this country plus around the world. Do you feel that your operations here that Interface are under more pressure because of some specific government rules here than they are elsewhere? Or maybe under less pressure, for all I know?
I wouldn't say they're under more pressure. I think what we have is we don't have an even playing field with energy prices, even within our own business. So our main manufacturing plant in North America, the energy prices in North America are substantially lower than they are in the European business. And as you know, with 5 manufacturing plants, we're a relatively small manufacturing business or organisation. We have very little choice. There's very little choice in the marketplace to be able to pick different energy profiles, which is why we embarked on a substantial energy reduction programme, which we think has been far more valuable to us as an organisation than looking at shaving cents or dimes off here and there in the energy sector.
So you've proved that you can do your sorts of manufacturing anyway in the UK at a reasonably competitive
reasonably competitive way, yes.
But maybe the big steel companies who are much more energy intensive than carpet manufacturing just feel they can't. But well, what about Jonathan's company, who runs 3 huge car plants?
It's going to be 4 with the engine plant.
Yeah, no, when you have that. Energy. Yeah. Anyway, it's not just energy. It's the general environmental climate of waste disposal, etc., etc. Is it a reasonable climate for you to operate in?
For us, it's trying to get the balance right. There's too many sticks as opposed to carrots. So, for example, with carbon legislation is very complex. So we have just for example, Solihull, where we manufacture the Land Rover product, is hit by EU ETS, European Emissions Trading Scheme, climate change agreements, and now CRC. So the carbon reduction commitment. We'd be better off, rather than spending £1 million on CRC, which is in effect a tax, better spending that money on doing renewables investment. We have a whole raft of projects we can apply that to, but they have to compete for funds like everything else. So we'd like more incentives to do the right thing as opposed to more of a tax.
Yes, Matt.
We operate across the globe, and typically we have the same price pressures and differentials. We compete for business within our own business unit, and energy prices are varying, but certainly they're all going up pretty well everywhere we operate, and that's one consistent theme. And so when we're building new buildings and expanding into China, how we design the buildings, same as the other companies here, how do we minimise recapture water, how do we make those as efficient as we possibly can? But typically what we'd like to see is less legislation around, is let the market drive the behaviour, and actually to your point, how do we set the incentives on innovation? We're excellent in this country, we're excellent historically at innovating, coming up with ideas, and I think that's one real strength of the UK, and it's something we ought to be able to build on for future development.
Well, I mean, but I suppose just to try to come back to you on that point, I mean, it's all very well to say let the market decide, but you're living in a world where you've got, I think the scientific consensus saying that global warming is a real problem. You've got to do something about CO2 reduction. And so therefore, just let the market decide to bring down CO2 for the whole world. I don't think that will really work. But anyway, let's just move on to something else, because I'm sure this will spark off some conversations and some debate later on. One thing which it did occur to me, which I hope is a valid and useful point in listening to everyone, is the amount of transparency and disclosure that the companies go in for, is that sufficient to really let other people, the members of the public and informed onlookers, decide who really is adopting a so-called green agenda and who isn't? Because obviously there's a certain amount of public relations about all this, which is indisputable. I mean, for example, I always found it very hard with Interface, for example, to find out not so much the reductions in waste or CO2, but I used to find it terribly hard to find out how much of specific materials you made or you used per year and how much you put into landfill. To talk about tons, I found very few companies were prepared to talk about tons of stuff that they were making. I think the only one who did it in their annual report was, odd enough, Procter & Gamble. Everyone else steered away from that because they feared, I suppose, that they would give away something competitive to other companies. And I think this contributes to a kind of general feeling amongst the public that you don't really know who's good and who's bad, because there's a certain amount of PR going on, and a certain amount of kind of special pleading by the individual companies. How do you all approach that? Perhaps start with Suzanne, who's representing an organisation with many members. Do you think this is a fair point, or do you think the amount of disclosure that people do go in for is good enough?
My personal view is that it depends what you're trying to derive from having that knowledge. And actually, when you look at a lot of British manufacturing, a lot of it is actual niche manufacturing. So manufacturing made to order, or meeting specific specifications that have been set by the customers, with a lot of diversity on production lines. And therefore, the tonnages and data will vary considerably from year to year for those sorts of manufacturers. And there's definitely a large proportion of manufacturers operating in that space. So there is some questions about whether, what is the benefit of benchmarking data when you have such high volumes of niche manufacturing.
Because you can't make easy comparisons.
Yes,
in other words.
exactly.
Yes, yes. Okay, well, leave it there. But perhaps ask Nigel about this point. I mean, are you disclosing more hard data than you used to, and are you disclosing enough?
I think yes and yes, in a very short answer. But we were challenged by our sales and marketing people a few years ago because our customers were asking for more transparency and a better way of understanding if they're buying product A from customer A against product B from customer B. How could there be disclosure in there so that you could compare apples with apples? So we embarked on a very aggressive programme for full product transparency within our industry, and we use a third-party accredited system called Environmental Product Declarations, EPDs, that use life cycle analysis, so a scientific rigour around the raw materials and the impacts, and with that, established product category rules so that everybody compares the same. And what we found now within our industry is that all our competitors now are following our lead and going down the EPD route. So an architect or a designer now can get the EPDs from two different companies and compare them in a very transparent and a very open manner.
Right, okay then.
Can I just have a little point on the back of that? I think it's interesting that you mention architects because the introduction of BREEAM in this country has really, by creating a system where the architect, the buyer, is demanding the information from the manufacturer, that has driven the disclosure of information because it creates a value of having that information.
Indeed.
And so there's been a real revolution, I think, in that particular sector because of that demand is for a useful purpose and intent.
Okay, what's your answer, Nigel? Sorry, Jonathan, yes.
Well, for us in the automotive sector, the very valid comparison is your tailpipe emissions, your grams per kilometre. So that's all regulated. You've got it compare between vehicles of different manufacturers, and obviously you can compare your new Land Rover versus your old one. But I'd reinforce the point that Nigel made. This is about life cycle impacts. Got to be very careful just focusing on one part of the life cycle, which of course tailpipe emissions is. As we go to more electrification, hybrids, etc., you're pushing the impacts to different parts of the life cycle. So again, we prefer a life cycle approach, and we publish our results, and it's through an industry standard, and the industry uses the same databases. So there is a degree of, we need to be more open with that life cycle data, but I would argue, does the member of the public really understand a life cycle assessment when they see it?
Yes, but I mean, of course, the more data you disclose, the more you get asked to disclose, I suppose. And you could say, in your case, you're going down this route of making aluminium bodies, which is good because it's light, and so therefore you need less fuel to carry it than steel. But at the same time, aluminium is highly energy intensive as a material. You have to stick in so much energy to get a ton of aluminium. I won't even ask. Are you starting to address that in your
and that's
data?
That's where the closed loop comes in, because that's the environment driving the business decision.
But are you actually then going into the supply chain and talking about that?
Yes.
As well?
So with our suppliers of aluminium, without that recycled content, like I mentioned, that 50% at the moment, looking to get up to 75%, the environmental equation won't work because the amount of energy intensive processes that have gone to make that aluminium, if it was all virgin, you wouldn't get the life cycle impact reduction. So you have to have closed loop. But it also saves money as well.
Yeah.
That's the key point. It's your raw material costs are going to be lower to the supplier.
And then with Matt, I mean, you've been explaining that your bit of Caterpillar anyway is almost involved with something that seems quite green, i.e. taking old machines and refurbishing them, really. But are you able to disclose to the outside world how much energy, how many tons of steel, etc., you're saving the world from doing?
Yeah, so Caterpillar operates in many different business sectors, and so even the comparison across our businesses gets somewhat challenged. But we publish a sustainability report every year. That's publicly available on the CAT website, and within that there's sections on what do we do for buildings, what do we do in terms of locomotive rebuilds. For remanufacturing, in 2012 we brought back 165 million kilograms of iron and put that back through our remanufacturing processes. So it's available, but I think we can always do more, and giving that in a digestible format I think is really the key.
Yeah, okay then. Well, look, it's time to kind of get other people to say something now, really, because obviously I could keep asking questions all night.